Hi everyone, it's Meg. Welcome back to my channel and Happy New Year's. If I sound nasally, it's because I am. I'm recovering from a flu. Today I'm finally giving in and covering the Richard Ramirez case. I've been restraining from doing this case because I feel like it's already pretty popularized in American Horror Story and the Netflix documentaries and other documentaries. But I'm not going to be spending hours on end talking about him. I'm going to try to wrap it up in a pretty relatively short video given the amount of information that's on him. Just to warn people, Richard is a serial killer, so there's going to be a lot of killing and murders and sexual assaults, and a lot of them. Also, this case does take place around 1985, so there's not as much detailed information on each killing. It's kind of just like this whole killing spree. Without further ado, let's get into Richard Ramirez's serial killing spree. So, Richard Ramirez was born on February 29th of 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children, and his father physically abused him, and he sustained multiple head injuries at a really young age, like around 6 years old. He had one injury that was so severe, he actually suffered from epileptic seizures. To escape his abusive father, he actually spent a lot of time with his cousin Miguel, who was unfortunately not a better influence on him, and was just as bad or possibly worse than his father. So his cousin was a Vietnam War veteran, and when he was 12 years old, his cousin showed him pictures of women that he would sexually assault, raped, tortured, sodomized, and even dismembered when he was spending time in Vietnam. The next year after he started spending time with his cousin actually shot his wife. And this is when Richard Ramirez started developing a love for Satanism, and was addicted to drugs and was still under the influence of his terrible cousin. His cousin wasn't committed for any of his little demeanors and killing his wife because they ruled him to have insanity and that this was a mental issue that they couldn't arrest him for. So Richard also began getting obsessed with kind of a sexual physical violence, and his cousin Miguel showed him the way. So at a really young age, around his teen years, Richard began doing little break-ins here and there, breaking into homes and doing petty crimes, and he eventually dropped out of high school and moved to Los Angeles. He was briefly in prison in LA for stealing some cars, but wasn't in there for too long. Between 1970 and 1980, he had crimes related to theft and drug possession. His first victim took place in Monterey Park, Los Angeles in June 1984. To a 79-year-old widow, Jenny Vinco, was found brutally murdered in her apartment. So while she was sleeping, he was continuously raping and stabbing her, and so much so that he nearly decapitated her when he was slashing her throat. How he got into the apartment was he came in through the mesh window of her apartment, and he actually left fingerprints and evidence behind. Wasn't too careful. So this was his first murder at the time. However, later on evidence showed that there was a separate murder that deemed it his first murder. We'll get into that later on. His second victim would take place in Rosemead, California, not too far from Los Angeles. On March 17, 1985, Maria Hernandez was a 22-year-old living in Rosemead. She was attacked right outside her house while she was pulling the trash cans into the house when Richard Ramirez pulled out his signature .22 caliber handgun. We'll see this a lot throughout the next many victims, and he shot her in the face. She ended up lifting her hands to protect herself, and this actually saved her life. And she was holding her keys while she was lifting her hands to protect herself, and the bullet knocked off the keys and didn't even touch her. She ended up playing dead until Richard Ramirez left. However, her roommate wasn't so lucky. Richard Ramirez ended up going into her apartment and finding her roommate, Dale Okazaki, who was a 34-year-old. She heard the gunshot and immediately went to go hide beneath the counter of the kitchen, and as she peeked out from the counter to see if he was there in their apartment, he shot her in the face, and this killed her instantly. That same night, Richard Ramirez would commit his third murder / attack his third victim. This was 1 hour after killing Dale Okazaki. He pulled 30-year-old Veronica Yu out of her own car in Monterey Park and shot her twice with the .22 caliber handgun and fled the scene. Veronica was rushed to the hospital but then later pronounced dead. in the night. So now with 2 murders and 1 attempted murder, Richard Ramirez was big on the media right now, and they described him as a curly-haired guy with bulging eyes and wide-spaced rotting teeth, and they labeled him the walking killer. This is obviously not the name that we know him by, but he'll get that name later on. 1 week later, he would commit his 4th and 5th murder/attack. He went into the home that he had burglarized actually a year earlier in Whittier, California at 2 a.m. 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara was sleeping soundly in his own house when Richard Ramirez pulled out a gun and shot him in the head with his .22 caliber handgun. His 44-year-old wife, Maxine, was awoke from the shot immediately, and Richard Ramirez bound her hands and beat her. He demanded to know where all her valuables were and ransacked the room. Maxine was able to escape while Richard was looking through their things, and she went under her bed to get a handgun, which was not loaded. Seeing that she was trying to get a handgun to fight back, he shot her 3 times with the handgun and got a large knife from their own kitchen and stabbed her many times and cut her eyes out, gouged her eyes out, and put it in her own jewelry box, and he later kept this jewelry box as a souvenir. Their son Peter walked into his parents' bedroom and found his parents' dead bodies. Now, Richard Ramirez would leave evidence throughout his entire killing spree. However, it was taking place in 1985, so there wasn't a lot of technology at this time, so he would get away with many, as we will see. So he ended up leaving a footprint which belonged to a pair of Avia sneakers, and they found his footprint in the flower bed outside of this couple's house. And at the time, this was the only evidence that the police department had found. In addition, he did leave the bullet remains of his .22 caliber handgun that he's been using so far, and they kept bullets, so now they had 2 pieces of evidence. And they officially announced that the police department was dealing with a serial killer. Now, we will see that Richard Ramirez's type, he doesn't actually have a type. It's not a woman, it's not a man, it's not old people, it's not young people. Now, his sixth murder would take place in Monterey Park to a Bill Doy. On May 14 of 1985, Richard Ramirez entered the home of Bill, who was 66 years old at the time, and he was living with his disabled wife, Lillian, who was 56 years old. He surprised Bill in his own bedroom, and while Bill was reaching for a handgun, by his side, Richard Ramirez shot him in the face with his .22 caliber handgun and beat him to unconsciousness. He then went to Lillian's bedroom and bound her with thumb cuffs and raped her and beat her and forced her to show him where all the valuables in their house was. After Richard Ramirez left with the valuables, Bill was rushed to the hospital and later on pronounced dead that night. His 7th murder would occur on May 29th of 1985. Richard Ramirez drove a stolen car to Monrovia, California, and stopped at Mabel Bell's house, who was an 83-year-old, and her disabled sister, Florence Lang, who was an 81-year-old. He found a hammer in their own kitchen and beat and bound Florence, and then did the same to Mabel, and got an electrical cord that was frayed in the room, and he began electrocuting them with this frayed electrical cord. Crazy person. He then raped Florence and drew satanic symbols all over the room with some lipstick. 2 days later, they are both found in their house and taken to the hospital right away, where Mabel was later pronounced dead in the hospital. His 8th murder would take place the next day. Richard Ramirez would drive the stolen car to Burbank and snuck into Carol Kyle, who was a 42-year-old's home. At gunpoint, he bound her and her 11-year-old son with handcuffs and ransacked their house for valuables to steal. He ended up releasing her to show him where the valuables in the house were, and he would rape her and told her not to look at him or else he would gouge her eyes out. He then tied her back up with her son and fled. His 9th murder would take place in Arcadia. On July 2nd of 1985, he drove the stolen car to Arcadia now and went into Mary Cannon's house, who was a 75-year-old widow, and she was sleeping in her bedroom when he hit her with a lamp, stabbed her to death using a 10-inch butcher knife from her own kitchen, and based on the autopsy that was done on her body, they found that she was stabbed well after she was already dead. This is why I didn't want to do this case. I feel like I'm just murder, and I'm just going through the murders. Anyways, it does get interesting though. His 10th murder occurred on July 5th of 1985. He broke into a Sierra Madre home and beat a 16-year-old girl named Whitney Bennett with a tire iron while she was sleeping in her bedroom. So I guess his serial killer niche is breaking into people's homes in the dead of night, into their bedrooms while they're sleeping. After looking for a knife in her kitchen and finding there not to be any knife, he strangled her with her own telephone cord. And while he was strangling her with the electrical cord, the telephone cord, it began ripping and electrical sparks started flying out. And he took this as a sign that God was interfering with his killing, and he fled the scene. Winnie did survive, but she had a ton of stitches in order to close the lacerations on her scalp and on her neck. His 11th murder would occur in Monterey Park, so these are all cities in SoCal. On July 7th of 1985, Richard Ramirez would break into the home of Joyce Nelson, who was a 60-year-old woman. He found her sleeping on her living room couch and killed her by stomping on her to death. And they found an Avia sneaker imprinted on her face, and that's how they connected the murders. That is insane, to stomp her to death and finding the sneaker print on her face. That is insane. His 12th attempted murder would happen that same night, where he would drive down to 2 other neighborhoods before coming back to Monterey Park, and decided to go into Sophia Dickerman's house, who was a 63-year-old woman. He handcuffed her at gunpoint and raped her and stole her jewelry and then fled. His 13th and 14th victim would occur on July 20th of 1985. Richard Ramirez purchased a machete and then drove the stolen Toyota to Glendale. So now we're in Glendale. He broke into the home of Leah Kneading's house, who was 66 years old and lived with Maxon, who was 68 years old, and burst into their bedroom where they were sleeping and hacked them with the machete, finally finishing them off with a .22 caliber handgun. He then robbed them, as we see him do all the time in all these killings, and drove to Sun Valley, California. That same day, he would attack his 15th victim at 4:15 a.m. He broke into I'm not even going to try to pronounce this family home, and immediately shot, I'm also not going to try to pronounce this, immediately shot this guy in the head with his signature .22 caliber handgun while he was sleeping, and his wife automatically woke up from this and beat and raped her. He then bound their 8-year-old son and directed him to their family valuables, where he made him swear that those were all the valuables in the house and there was nothing else, and he made him swear on Satan. His 16th and 17th victim would occur in Northridge, California in August 6th of 1985. He broke into Chris and Virginia Peterson's bedroom. He crept into their bedroom and immediately shot 27-year-old Virginia in the face with his signature handgun. And Chris did try to flee, but Richard Ramirez shot him in the neck, and Chris actually fought back and was managed to avoid 2 of Richard Ramirez's shots before Richard Ramirez decided to flee the scene. Virginia was rushed to the hospital, and the couple luckily did survive. His 18th victim would occur in Diamond Bar, California on August 8th of 1985. He broke into the house of 27-year-old Sakina Abawath and her husband Elias Abawath, who was 31 years old. He broke in at 2:30 a.m. and went into their bedroom and immediately shot Elias in his head with his .22 caliber handgun, handcuffed and beat Sakina, and made her show him where all the valuables were. He then brutally raped her and made her swear on Satan that was all their valuables in their house. And that's when their 3-year-old child came into the bedroom, and he tied this kid up and raped his mom in front of him. Sakina was able to untie her child, and the 3-year-old ran to the neighbors by himself and knocked on the neighbor's door and asked for help for his mother. So that's when Richard Ramirez decided to flee. And Richard Ramirez had been following his own crimes on the media, like idolizing himself. He thought he was drawing way too much attention to himself, so he decided to move from SoCal to NorCal. So that's when he took a little road trip to San Francisco. His 19th and 20th victim would occur on August 18 of 1985, where he entered the home of Peter Pan. He entered the home of this guy named Peter Pan and his wife Barbara Pan, and shot Peter, who was 66 years old at the time, in the temple with his caliber gun, and this killed him immediately. He then sexually assaulted and beat Barbara, the 62-year-old woman, and then shot her in the head and left her for death. Before leaving, he used her red lipstick to draw a pentagram on their mirror and left a saying Jack the knife on the bedroom wall. He again left a shoe print that was the pair of Avia sneakers, which wasn't a super common shoe at the time, and this is how they started to find who he was. So PD contacted Avia Shoes and found the make, the model of the shoe print he left, and Avia said that they had only sent out 6 of them to the United States. They found out from the shoe print that it was a size 11.5, and so Avia said there was only 6 11.5s in the US. 5 of them were to other states, and 1 of them was sent to Los Angeles, California. So all they had to do from then was see who purchased them, and that's where they found Richard Ramirez had purchased 11.5 Avia sneakers. So with this information, with the Avia sneakers and the caliber gun, they released this information to the media saying to watch out with the guy who has Avia sneakers and a .22 caliber handgun. And obviously, when they released this information to the public, they knew that Richard Ramirez would be following the media, so they kind of expected him to toss out the shoes or toss out the handgun. And as he did, Richard Ramirez went to the Golden State Bridge and tossed his Avia sneakers over the edge, and they were later on found that night. So obviously he's drawing a lot of attention himself, so after killing Peter Pan and Barbara Pan, he decided to move back to Los Angeles and leave San Francisco alone. His 21st victim, August 24th of 1985, where he drove at 76 miles south of Los Angeles in a stolen orange Toyota to Mission Viejo. He broke into James Jr.'s house, who had just came back from a family vacation from Rosemead, Mexico, and his 13-year-old son happened to be awake at the time that Richard Ramirez broke in, and he heard the sound Richard Ramirez was making when he came into the house, and he immediately woke his dad. So they were both awake, his dad and the 13-year-old son, and Richard Ramirez decided to flee. Before he fled, though, James Jr., being so brave, ran outside and saw the make, model, color, license plate of the orange Toyota and called the police immediately. Unfortunately, that same night, these 2 people would not be so lucky. His 22nd and 23rd victim would happen to Bill Carnes, who was a 30-year-old, and his fiancée Inez Erickson, who was 29 years old, and he broke into their back door of their house. He entered their bedroom, awoke Bill immediately, and before Bill could do anything, he shot him in the head 3 times and then looked to Inez. He then told Inez that he was a night stalker and that he made her swear that she loved Satan and swear on Satan, and then he beat her with his own fists and bound her with neckties from the closet. He stole what he could find, then dragged her to a different room and raped her. He demanded more cash and more jewelry and made her swear on Satan that that was all the cash and jewelry they had in their house. He then told her to tell people that when the media came, to tell them that the Night Stalker was here. Inez was able to untie herself and ran to the neighbor's house to get help for her fiancé. Her fiancé ended up surviving. Surgeons removed 2 of 3 of the bullets that were in his head, which is amazing that he survived that. That's great that the surgeons were able to remove that and save his life. Inez, being a survivor, was able to give a detailed description of Richard Ramirez to the police, and they obtained another cast of his shoe prints from their house. Obviously, it wasn't the Avia sneakers at this time. This stolen orange Toyota was then found later on in Koreatown on August 28th, and they were able to get from this Toyota a single fingerprint on the rear view mirror of the car, even though Richard Ramirez was so careful to clean up his evidence on the car. Like, they were, some fingerprints were white, so he was trying to be careful, but he left 1 fingerprint, and that's when police put that in their system, and they found his mugshot and identified him as 25-year-old Richard Ramirez, who had a long list of violation and arrests in Texas, United States. On August 29th of 1985, the police released this information and his mugshot to the media. They had a press conference, and the PD said, "We know who you are, and now soon everyone else will. There will be no place you could hide." So before I talk about his capture, let's talk about the other 2 incidences that were actually under the radar, and they didn't connect this to him until later on. On June 27th of 1985, there was a 32-year-old woman named Patty Elaine who was murdered in Arcadia. Her body wasn't discovered until July 2nd when she didn't show up into work that day, and after being attacked, sodomized, and raped, they did connect this to Richard Ramirez. So, his capture. On August 30th of 1985, Richard Ramirez took a bus to Arizona to meet up with his brother. He's been following his media coverage for a while, but I guess he missed the recent coverage where his face was literally on every newspaper, television show, like everywhere his face was plastered on. His brother ended up not being home, so he took a bus back to Los Angeles, California. This situation is just literally insane. Like, when I was doing the research for this, I couldn't believe it. This sounds so made up, but just let's get into it. So Richard Ramirez walked right past police officers, and he saw them, but he didn't think like they were looking for him. And the police officers were actually waiting there in hopes that Richard Ramirez was already in California and that he was trying to get a bus out somewhere else and that he would take the bus to flee, so they were waiting at the bus stop for him to arrest him. So he walked past PD, didn't think much of it, entered into this convenience store in East LA, which is crazy because I used to live there. He walked past a group of women who were like whispering to each other, sort of loudly, saying like El Matador, which means like literally the killer in Spanish. He then didn't really think much of it, I guess, and he kept walking around the store, and then he saw his own face all over the newspapers, displayed all over the convenience store. Freaked out, and he ran out. He then decided to run across the Santa Ana freeway, and while he was running, literally this sounds insane, but like people were whispering around him and yelling and talking around him. El Matador, the killer, that's the Night Stalker. Like, he could just hear everyone talking. So he tried to carjack this unlocked Ford Mustang, but was pulled out immediately by the resident or the owner of the car. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. He then ran across the street to try to carjack a lady who was about to get into her car, Angelina Torr, and she put up a fight. She was trying to fight back with him, but he punched her in the stomach really hard, and he was able to get the keys. Angelina's neighbor, an 85-year-old Jose, tried to run out to help her, but Richard Ramirez threatened him with a gun. And then other residents came around and tried to restrain Richard, and her husband, Angelina's husband, hit him in the head with a fence post. And so Richard Ramirez decided to flee, and as he was running down Boyle Heights Street, a group of over 10 residents started running after him and caught him and held him down and started beating Richard Ramirez. And while they were beating him, they were yelling things like Night Stalker and awful things and El Matador, and as they should. At 8 a.m., police department was called with tips of a fight. When they got to the scene, Richard Ramirez was brutally beat, and they arrested him. But I just think that it's so great that, like, everyone in the city came together to try to capture this guy that they knew was this guy who's been killing so many people. But I just think it's great, like, the community came together. So the trial. Richard Ramirez's trial began on July 22nd of 1988. His first court appearance, he actually raised his hand that had a pentagram on it and started swearing off Satan and everything. On August 14th, the trial was interrupted because one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletary, who was supposed to show up, didn't show up, and they actually later on found out that day that she had been killed in her own apartment. And so people of the jury and everyone in general started freaking out because they thought maybe Richard Ramirez had accomplices. Turned out that she was actually killed by her own boyfriend, who later on committed suicide in a hotel with the same killer item that he used to kill his girlfriend. And it wasn't connected to Richard Ramirez at all, but people of the courtroom and the jurors were really scared to go home to their own houses, as they should. It's extremely scary, I'm sure. On September 20th of 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 accounts of attempted murder, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. And okay, so I was counting when I was doing the research, and it's not adding up, but I'm not sure how they add this stuff up, because I know sometimes they can't exactly pin him down for it because there's not enough DNA evidence. On November 7th of 1989, he was sentenced to die in a gas chamber. He said, "Big deal, death always went with the territory, see you in Disneyland," whatever the heck that means. Now, Richard Ramirez's trial cost $1.8 million, which at the time was the most expensive trial, and then the O.J. Simpson murder came along and that trumped his $1.8 million trial. During his time in jail, he had tons of fans writing to him, girls fangirling over him and loving him, and he actually connected with this one girl who wrote him 75 letters. Her name was Doreen Leoy, who fell in love with him, and he actually proposed to her October 3rd of 1996 and married her in California San Quentin State Prison. And so they're married for a long time, and for years leading up to Richard Ramirez's death, she did say that the day that he would be executed, she would commit suicide. But they actually separated when Doreen found out that he had killed a 9-year-old girl and raped her and killed her. His first victim that we initially said was Jenny Vinco in Glass Hill, California. However, they found out that decades later after his arrest that he had actually killed and sodomized and raped a 9-year-old girl on April 10th of 1984, making this his first murder. At the time of Richard Ramirez's death in 2013, he was actually engaged to Christine Lee, who was a 23-year-old writer, and like, how was he getting girls in prison, murdering tons of people? So obviously there's someone for everyone out there. There's tons of fish in the sea. Richard Ramirez died of complications to B-cell lymphoma at Marine General Hospital in California on June 7th of 2013, 53-year-old at the time of his death. He also had traces of chronic substance abuse and chronic hepatitis C, which was a viral infection. Richard Ramirez would have been executed in his early 70s, and it's that late on in his life because of the California's like slow, lengthy appeals process, but he served time on death row for 23 years before he died at 53. So let's talk about motives. So psychiatrists say that his main motive, or what it was that he was mentally unstable, and as we know, as a child he was beat and hit in the head many times, which resulted in temporal lobe epilepsy, aggressivity, and hypersexuality. He also had a schizoid personality disorder. They also said that he was not born a psychopath. He was actually made into a psychopath due to his cousin and his father, and I guess the people just surrounding him and how he grew up. Anyways, that's all I have on today's case. I'm sure the documentary is much lengthier, much more detailed, but I just thought we'd kind of run through the overall logistics of Richard Ramirez. And I know people don't like watching quite a long video sometimes. As always, thanks for watching, guys, and I hope to see you guys in my next video. Bye!